Welcome to the James Wilson Institute and First Liberty's Center on Religion, Culture, and Democracy's Zoom webinar, Judicial Nominations in President Trump's Second Term, Form and Substance, with Professor Robert Luther. He'll help us anticipate in today's presentation President Trump's judicial nominations and describe the judicial nomination process, drawing on his Capitol Hill and White House experience. The questions he'll address include: how will the Senate composition impact judicial nominations? How many seats will be open to fill? Will blue slips still apply for district court nominees? Will any circuit seats be moved to different states? What types of judges will President Trump nominate? And how will this differ from his last term? And more. After the presentation, the floor will be open to questions. Rob Luther was appointed Associate Professor of Law in 2025 at the Antonin Scalia Law School of George Mason University. He teaches and writes on the federal courts, legal and judicial ethics, political law, Congress, and also professional sports. He served at high levels in all three branches of the federal government and recently founded Constitutional Solutions PLLC, a law firm that navigates judicial candidates, judges, elected officials, professional athletes, and executives through high-stakes hearings, investigations, and reputational attacks. Prior to joining the Scalia Law faculty, he served as Associate Counsel to the President in the White House Counsel's Office. In the White House, he co-managed the judicial selection process and supervised the preparation of over 150 federal judicial nominees for their successful U.S. Senate confirmation hearings. The New York Times Magazine referred to his work on judicial selection during this period as, quote, unique in White House history. On a personal note, we at the James Wilson Institute have known Rob for over a decade, so it's a delight to have him as part of this webinar series. And I was also Rob's student when I attended Scalia Law in his pioneering class, Legal Writing for Law Clerks. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Garrett, and thanks to the James Wilson Institute and First Liberty for inviting me to deliver this talk. As some of you know, I worked on judicial selection starting with President Trump's Supreme Court list through his 2016 transition and on into the White House from Inauguration Day through the nomination of 150 judges during his first term, as Garrett mentioned. And I continue to advise candidates navigating judicial politics today. So I'm going to talk about judicial nominations in Trump's second term. I'm going to do so by addressing three issues. First, the judicial nominations landscape in recent years. Second, the claims about what judicial selection will purportedly look like over the course of President Trump's second term. And finally, as someone with some visibility into the current White House counsel's office process, what I anticipate judicial selection will actually look like over the course of this term. Now, at the outset, let's define what judicial selection actually looks like in practice. For starters, I can tell you what it is not. It is not just sitting in a room deciding who you want to put on the bench. That's the fun part, but it's a very small part of the process. Thinking that the job is just coming up with names and vetting people is simply the wrong way to conceptualize the landscape, because that's purely reactive. Directing judicial strategy, however, is a highly proactive process, brokering deals between three parties: the White House and the relevant state's two senators. Like litigation, if you want to win, you have to be aggressive. So generally the process moves like this. First, you and your team come up with a preliminary group of names. Then you run informal background checks on those names. Then you conduct interviews. Then you approach the relevant senators and negotiate. Then you brief the president. Then you run your formal background checks. Then you brief the senators on the results of those background checks. Then the president nominates a candidate. Then you prepare your candidate for the confirmation hearing. Then you deal with the media that is trying to kill your nominee. And finally, you make sure your nominee is confirmed. Now, President Trump currently has made he's got 4 confirmations under his belt, 1 circuit judge and 3 district judges. He's still got 59 seats to fill, but he's made nominations to 11 of those 59 seats that are pending in the Senate, which means he still has 48 more nominations to make. Now, these 48 seats are particularly important because he isn't going to have anywhere near the vacancies we had in 2017. He had 108 vacancies on Inauguration Day in 2017, including, as you know, Justice Scalia's seat. He had 17 circuit vacancies. Realistically, that 108 number from 2017 is probably close to the number of confirmations he'll secure over the entirety of this term, assuming Republicans keep the Senate. Maybe a few more, maybe around 120 in total. So to recap, President Trump appointed 234 judges during his first term. On election day this time, there were only around 45 vacancies and only 4 circuit seats: Tennessee, New Jersey, Maine, and Delaware. Now, unfortunately for the Trump administration, immediately after his election this time, the number of judicial vacancies did not grow, it actually shrank. 3 Democrat appointees who had sent then President Biden conditional retirement letters withdrew them, so Trump couldn't appoint their successors. Now, this occurred on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit by Judge James Wynn, on the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Ohio, Judge Algernon Marbley, and on the U.S. District Court for the Western District of North Carolina, Judge Max Cogburn. In each of these cases, judicial misconduct complaints were filed, and as far as I know, investigations are still underway. I hope that these judges are disciplined for violating the Code of Conduct provisions that prohibit participation in political activity. Now, let me be clear. A judge can retire whenever he or she wants. But if he or she unretires by withdrawing a retirement letter based on the results of a presidential election, that's a violation of Canons 2 and 5. So won't more Republican appointees retire this term? Yes, but this raises the question, what will judicial selection look like this term? I look at this landscape through 2 lenses: form and substance. Now, form relates to situational and procedural questions. How much will the composition of the Senate change the type of nominees that are selected? How many seats will be open to fill? Will blue slips still apply on district courts? Will any circuit seats be moved to different states? So let's take these questions one by one. The composition of the Senate. The president may nominate judges, but obviously the Senate confirms them. So the type of nominee the president can make is different when you have 50, 51, and then more than 51 votes. As you know, Republicans currently possess 53 votes in the Senate. Seats. As I mentioned, there are 48 current vacancies awaiting nomination. Now, for comparison, President Trump had 140 vacancies in June of 2017. There are currently 6 circuit vacancies, but only 2 have opened since inauguration: Judge Ikuda of the Ninth Circuit and Judge Sykes of the Seventh Circuit. 3 of the 6 seats will flip from blue to red: Tennessee, Maine, New Jersey, and 3 will remain red to red: California, Delaware, and Wisconsin. Now, without getting all Stephen Hawking on these numbers, I can tell you this. President Trump secured 54 circuit confirmations during his first term. President George W. Bush secured 62 over 2 terms. President Obama secured 55 over 2 terms, and President Biden secured 45 in 1 term. So if you take the universe of circuit judges that were eligible to retire when Trump first took office, 2017, there were about 100. And as you know, 54 were confirmed. So about 54% of the eligible number of circuit judges turned over. This term, there are not over 100 retirement eligible circuit judges. There are 61. So if President Trump secures 54% this time of the 61 retirement eligible circuit judges, he will end up with 33 over his 4-year term, assuming Republicans keep the Senate. And obviously, if they don't, well, that number is going to fall off the cliff. 33 circuit judges over a 4-year term is about 8 per year. That's the same rate the Senate confirmed George W. Bush's circuit judges at. Remember, he secured 62 over 8 years. Fewer seats to fill means tougher confirmation battles. That was certainly the case during the Bush administration. So with so few circuit vacancies forthcoming this term, focus is likely to eventually turn to the district courts because, well, there's a lot more of them. But as we know, while the White House has the thumb on the scale for the circuit courts, the senators have their thumbs on the scale for the district courts. Now, Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa has returned as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. This is a very good thing. Recall that under his leadership in 2017, the Senate abandoned the blue slip requirement for circuit judges. That was absolutely the right decision by the chairman, and his leadership in that respect paved the way for President Trump to move forward with some of the best circuit judges of his term. Blue slips on district courts. Now, senators from both parties have continuously supported having a complete veto over the president's district court nominees in their states. To me, a big open question for judicial selection this term will be to what extent Chairman Grassley will uphold the senatorial blue slip veto for district court nominees. Why is this so important? Well, because there were 26 retirement eligible circuit judges on inauguration day in inauguration day of this term, but 19 of them were already eligible to retire when Trump took office the first term. So the reality seems to be that a whole lot of circuit judges just don't want to retire. Now, maybe that wouldn't matter so much if there were a whole bunch of Republican appointed circuit judges hitting retirement eligibility this term, but there is not. The number is shockingly low. There's only 5 of them, and 4 are currently the chief judges of their court, which means they're even less likely probably to go senior. So, getting back to district courts, if President Trump is going to have any meaningful impact on the Court of Appeals this time, his nominees will need to arise from the older judges who declined to retire during the first term, not some sitting group of new judges who are just hitting retirement age now. If those older judges don't retire, giving the overall lack of judgeships to fill, and if blue state district courts are just sitting there empty, at some point, either the president or the Republican base or somebody is likely to be pressuring Chairman Grassley to do something about it. Now, President Trump has had firsthand experience over the last few years dealing with good district judges and bad district judges. He's already solidified his legacy on the Supreme Court and on the Court of Appeals. If he truly wants to remake the federal judiciary in his image this term, he's going to have to make more of an impact on the district courts. So that's form. What about substance? Will the president be looking for different kinds of nominees this term compared to 2017? The breadth and depth of the commentary on this point differs a little bit, but I think that most of us commentators are essentially saying the same things. Now, my former colleague Mike Davis, now of the Article 3 Project, who was Chairman Grassley's chief nominations counsel in the Senate when I was doing nominations in the White House, has said repeatedly that President Trump should nominate judges who are, quote, even more bold and more conservative and more fearless, end quote, than those from the first term. More recently, my former colleague Mike Fregoso, who served with me on the Judiciary Committee and at DOJ when I was in the White House, published an essay entitled Why Trump's Judicial Picks Should Look Different in 2025 Than They Did in 2017. Now, I understand the takeaway from Fregoso's article to be as follows. In 2017, we were still operating under the old rules of both the House and the Senate and, well, politics generally. We had 52 Republican votes in the Senate, which ended up really being more like 51 or even 50 most of the time due to Senator McCain's illness. And even though the Republicans controlled the Senate, a lot of them were still somewhat skeptical of President Trump. But then some things changed. Justice Kavanaugh was defamed, the Democrats broke all the rules, and President Trump was reelected by a landslide. So that means that prudential considerations that constrained selections in the past don't really apply anymore. And so, according to Fregoso, that should cause the White House to prioritize judicial nominees with experience in areas of law that matter most to the based wing of the Republican Party today. Now, I agree with Fregoso that the only contemporary rule in judicial politics is power. So I acknowledge that the selection process is likely to be tweaked a little bit this term. It is my understanding that over the next 4 years, there will be an even greater emphasis on whether judicial candidates have bled on the battlefield of the conservative legal movement. Candidates who have just been plodding along in private practice without ever facing public criticism will be, and should be, rejected by the White House. This was our approach during the first term, but I hope that the current group ratchets it up to the next level. The executive is charged with implementing the political will of the people, and this is what the electorate that re-elected President Trump to office in the wake of the lawfare he underwent demands. And so if this is a litmus test, so be it. During the first term, I used to ask interviewees to tell us about a time in their personal professional life where they stood for principle and paid the price. In the same vein, moving forward, I think candidates interviewing with the White House should be expected to be asked, what have you done to show that you share the president's worldview? What have you done to show that you share the president's judicial philosophy? For example, such a question might be, do you believe that immigration laws should be fully enforced, notwithstanding public sentiment? This is nothing new. This is not a loyalty oath. Presidents throughout history have frequently required that their nominees share some connection to them or to the party, and the president has the right to know what he's getting when he invests his political capital into a nominee. I expect to see more of this term, and I'm fully on board with it. So is this actually happening? Have the nominees look different this time? Well, let's take a look. The first wave included a Sixth Circuit nominee, Whitney Hermendorfer, who had replaced an Obama nominee. Whitney is a 37-year-old native of Nashville. She was captain of the women's basketball team at Princeton and editor-in-chief of the Law Review at George Washington. I guess she didn't get into George Mason, but anyway. She practiced at Williams and Connolly and clerked for Judge Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit and then Justice Alito and Justice Barrett on the Supreme Court. Most recently, she was Director of Strategic Litigation in the Office of Attorney General in Tennessee, which is essentially like their Solicitor General. She's also one of the nicest people you could ever meet. Second wave included the president's personal lawyer and now senior DOJ official, Emil Bove, to a seat on the Third Circuit previously from New Jersey. I'm sure the White House really lost a lot of sleep nominating him over Senator Booker's objections. Now, in the third wave, in California, the president nominated Eric Tung, a former law clerk to Justice Scalia and to Justice Gorsuch, currently an appellate partner at Jones Day, and Eric previously served in DOJ under Trump. He also nominated a First Circuit nominee from Maine, Josh Dunlap, Notre Dame law graduate, clerk for a Republican appointee on the 10th Circuit, recommended by a number of people with strong contacts in Maine, and is also a Blackstone Fellow. And then, in his most recent wave, he nominated Jen Mascott to a seat in Delaware. Jen, as you may know, clerked for Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Thomas. She was the director of the Gray Center at Scalia Law, where I teach. She's well known for her expertise in constitutional law and administrative law, and she's testified before the Senate many times before. So, taking a look at this group, are they much different from our circuit nominees? Well, if you look at the first wave of 11 judges this term, 10 of the 11 are members of the Federalist Society. The only one who is not is Emil. Now, Emil's attracted a lot of attention, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about him here because he may not be as well known to all of you as some of the Federalist Society members. So the most important question, of course, is Emil conservative? Yes, I'm so confident that Emil is conservative that I wrote an op-ed supporting him in the Washington Examiner. I mentioned Mike Fregoso earlier. I'm going to quote him again. He sent a message out on Twitter or on X that said, "When Nancy Gertner and Mike Ludig both oppose you, that's a good sign you're doing something right." I think that about sums it up. So what does Emil's background look like? Let me briefly quote my op-ed. Compare his resume to that of President Trump's first ever appellate nominee, Judge Amul Thapar. Bove and Thapar both graduated from top 15 law schools, both clerked for federal district and circuit judges. They spent a brief amount of time in private practice as litigation associates before serving as federal prosecutors and then returning to private practice prior to entering high-level DOJ positions prior to being nominated to the federal bench. I go on to say that ironically, it appears that some of the criticism of Emil's nomination from the right can be traced back to his willingness to actually put into practice the theories that have been touted by many of us for much of our lives. He has demonstrated fortitude in the face of hostility from Washington elites. He put into practice, our long-held views of a strong unitary executive by downsizing bloated DOJ and eliminating, left-wing career prosecutors who were promoting DEI and other inappropriate policies at the Department of Justice. This is what conservatives want, and this is what Emil has done and put his law license on the line to secure. If this all makes him a henchman, then I think we should pray for a federal judiciary full of them. You may have seen his confirmation hearing. I have seen hundreds of them, and I have seen few witnesses who handled the heat as well as he did. So what about the fact that he's not a member of the Federalist Society? Well, 46 of the 54 first-term Trump circuit judges are Federalist Society members, which means that 8 are not. Now, included on that list are Marvin Quattlebaum of the Fourth Circuit, and Mike Scudder and Tom Kirsch of the Seventh Circuit. Look at their records, look at their judicial decisions, look at their votes. They have been excellent conservative judges, and I would recommend them again. So, look, the public branding of the new judges may be a little bit different this term, but substantively, I don't see a material difference between term one and term two with respect to the qualifications or judicial philosophies of the circuit nominees or the district nominees to date. These people look like the Trump appointees that I was involved in recommending during the first term. And by all accounts, they appear to have the necessary fortitude that we emphasized then, and which I have subsequently discussed in my 2024 Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy essay, aptly titled Judicial Selection After the 2024 Election. So, about this point of judicial fortitude. Now, remember, the Don McGahn White House counsel's office started the trend of promoting judges from SG's offices and smaller firms because we concluded these people would be great judges because they had the courage to take on controversial issues and stand up in court to defend them. That trend has continued, as we see from the nominees to date, and my understanding is that it will continue. So what about the Supreme Court? If there are Supreme Court vacancies this term, I believe that they will be judges we have come to know over the past few years because they took their seat during Trump's first term. I think many of the names that we've heard that remain realistic possibilities, including Judge Greg Katsas of the D.C. Circuit, Judge Andy Oldham or Kyle Duncan of the Fifth Circuit, maybe Judge Kat Mizell or Judge Eileen Cannon of the district courts in Florida. It's possible that someone like Solicitor General John Sauer, who clerked for Justice Scalia and is a Rhodes Scholar, could jump the line. But if I were to bet, I'd stick with the names we're most familiar with. As we have already seen from the nominations to date, the district court's general pool is almost certainly going to be about the same as the last time because there's a minimum expectation of conservatism and talent. The picks thus far, the Missouri District Court nominees, the Florida District Court nominees, they've been excellent. Former state solicitor generals, state judges, and a critical mass of Federal Society members. The American people have come to expect a certain type of nominee from President Trump. At the end of the day, it's really that simple. Now, with that said, I'm going to send out the bat signal to any originalist and textualist judges who may be watching, who are eligible to go senior, but may be concerned about the quality of their potential successor. Put that fear behind you. White House counsel Dave Warrington and his team are working incredibly hard, interviewing very impressive candidates, and they've picked up right where Don McGahn and his team left off. Nobody is going to be disappointed with any of these nominees except the Democrats. So that's what I see, and I'm happy with it. I may not have personally chosen every single person they've chosen to date, just as this group may not have personally chosen every person that we recommended when we were there, but the process is working, and people who care about putting solid conservatives on the bench should be happy with it. So thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take some questions now.
Excellent. Rob, I'm going to start us off with a handful of questions before we get to audience questions. However, the audience is encouraged to submit their questions for the program. So, Rob, I wanted to ask you just kind of how you square the trend towards younger nominees with having battle scars. Because, let's say you're Josh Devine, 35 years old. You had to have a lot go right to line yourself up to have battle scars in pretty short, like an 8 to 10 year, career in legal practice. Whereas if we're demanding more battle scars to now show bona fides, I would imagine it's somebody who's had closer to 20 years of legal practice as opposed to such a short amount of time. Maybe you can tell me what you think the White House counsel's office is looking for if they're trying to combine both the youth and the battle and the battle scars.
Well, they're certainly not looking for people to grow in office. Josh has done more, Judge Devine has done more in his, relatively young career than most people do in a lifetime. but it starts from the premise of the fact that he was never afraid to stake out conservative positions and talk about them and write about them and take them up in his professional practice. He was writing about conservative concepts in college, in law school. He sought out opportunities to promote those principles, working in the Senate on the Judiciary Committee with Senator Hawley, going back to Missouri to be the SG and be the tip of the spear on this sort of aggressive, social policy litigation. Whitney Hermendorfer, same exact thing. So, I don't think it's really a question of age. I mean, these people have a decade of legal practice, but probably 2 decades of experience engaging with ideas, taking difficult positions, and being unafraid. And, by the time you're in your late 30s, early 40s, up for a judgeship, there shouldn't be any question about where you stand on core principles. Now, I understand that nuanced issues like trade, views on this evolve over time. But where you stand on the fundamental principles that a conservative believes do not evolve, and they have not evolved.
We at the James Wilson Institute are celebrating at this moment the first of the fellowship alumni to become a federal judge. Zachary Bluestone, one of the president's nominees for the open seats in the state of Missouri, was just confirmed last week by a 49-47 number, which I'll draw on. Rob, you clerked for Judge Dan Mannion, and his nickname was Landslide Dan. It seems like all the good nominees, because Judge Mannion that then was confirmed by a tight margin when he became a Seventh Circuit judge. It seems like all the nominees worth their salt are being confirmed by tight margins now. Could you kind of describe why the nomination process sort of assumes just like such rote like partisanship, even for the majority of these district court nominees, and how that might present a challenge if there are ever nominees that may present? And I'm thinking some of the nominees in the first Trump term that had to be pulled because of the tight margins. Maybe that just like that tight margin could prove an issue.
Well, as I explain it, when society decided that the courts were in a better position to decide all of our policy issues than the legislature, the necessary consequence of that move is that the stakes are going to be ratcheted up for the individuals put in the position to make those decisions. And that has caused confirmation battles to escalate into circuses, starting with Robert Bork, Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh, and frankly, over the last few months, Emil Bove. A person should not have to undergo relentless defamatory character assassination to assume a role in public life. That is not what the confirmation process was designed to achieve. But, I'm seeing a common theme between the 4 nominees that I just made. They're all Republicans. I don't recall Democrat nominees having to go through a similar process. So, some people, when they don't like the outcome of elections, decide to take out their frustration this way. And we just need to make sure that our people continue to be confirmed.
Rob, we noticed in Judge Bluestone's Senate questionnaire, one of the questions from Senator Whitehouse was directly asking for then candidate Bluestone's understanding of how natural law should inform the work of the judge. And candidate Bluestone answered those questions admirably. When you were in the White House counsel's office, how often did probing questions of first principles touch on a connection between law and philosophy, law and morality, maybe as a way to have the nominees think, or at least demonstrate their thinking to you? I mean, how do you think this White House counsel's office is perhaps trying to sort of ask questions that go beyond the kind of the typical questions that may arise during a hearing?
Well, I'm always listening for signals of what a candidate actually believes about their place in the universe and their role as a judge. And of course, we've scrutinized their records, written records, and so forth to get a sense of what they may have said in the past about these principles. So, you come to the interview as a totality of your life's journey, not only in society, but in the law, of course. And we, make a collective judgment based on the complete record. We ask questions about judicial philosophy, cases that I think are right or wrong and why, although we never ask them how they would rule on a future case. Of course, we're trying to get a sense of how they think and what's important to them. And, do they share the president's judicial philosophy? My understanding is that the questions this time are generally similar to that because these are the questions you need to ask and have answered because this is the process, and that's what's paramount in the process is getting a sense of where the person understands their limitations of the role. And so I'm glad that they're continuing to ask similar questions, and I think they're doing a great job.
Yeah, part of the, I think, appeal of such an impressive cadre of staff in the White House counsel's office in the Trump 47 term is that they were able to build on the foundation that you, Don McGahn, our pal Jed Doty, and so many of the others who served in the Trump 45 White House, the foundation that they laid. Where do you see the foundation that you laid as being most enduring, and then where do you see the foundation that you laid as maybe being in a in a positive way reformed and changed, and how do you see that kind of coming forth with the with the nominees that we've seen so far?
I think of two things immediately out of the gate there. I think obviously the Supreme Court, the change in personnel has had a material impact on the law across the board, on policies, practices, and behaviors everywhere, every day. And, we've been winning a lot more than I can remember, certainly as a law student, where all I ever saw was Scalia dissenting, Thomas dissenting. Those days are over. And that is due to, you know, a long march from a lot of people that no one's ever heard of, putting in time behind the scenes on this project, finding the right people, working through, doing the hard work, doing the work that nobody talks about to ensure that when the time came, the right people were ready. And, I'm very proud of that work and of, the justices and their unwillingness to be intimidated by what others are trying to do to dissuade them. Fortitude is essential. Justice Thomas is the model. And I think the Trump justices have done a great job. I think the other enduring legacy is the law clerks. The law, every time someone is confirmed, every time a Trump judge is confirmed, that's 30 years of 3 to 4 law clerks, basically 100 law clerks for every Trump judge. The impact of the people that I have seen, I've met dozens of these students over the last, 8 years. Obviously, many of them have been my students. Over 150 of my students have secured federal clerkships. But I've met hundreds of these people that would not have had this opportunity. Brilliant young conservative lawyers would not have had this opportunity if Trump wouldn't have won and our people wouldn't have had great people in that office to ensure that the best people were nominated to these important lifetime positions. There will be thousands of conservative lawyers with federal clerkships impacting law and society throughout eternity as a consequence of that work. And, one little decision can have a never-ending ripple that you can't even understand. So, I am delighted every time I meet someone who tells me they had a chance to clerk for one of the people that we put through the process. And, truly that impact, echoes in eternity.
Wow, well said, well said.
I had a quick question. Garrett sort of already asked a version of this question about the battle scars, but as I contemplate that point, I think about the importance of battle scars more generally for folks that haven't started their legal careers. And so things that may not be battle scars per se, but at least still function similarly to sort of indicate that level of fortitude, seriousness, and level of, the prince and shared principles and values. And as someone like myself who is an aspirational one day, hopefully Article 3 law clerk, how important is it for me to be active in things that sort of begin to telegraph that? Or is it not important? Is it something I should shy away from to appear sort of neutral at an early stage? I've gotten conflicting advice across the spectrum. Thank you.
Well, you should never hide who you are. I've always been myself. It's worked out okay for me. Back to the battle scar question about, like Whitney and Josh, going into, running into the fire is how you get noticed. And, look, going to big law out of law school versus going to the state SG's office is fine. That's fine. I mean, you can learn a lot and do interesting work and make good money. And like a lot of people do it. And, that's fine. But the question, to us or to me or that I think about is, well, maybe those people shouldn't get the preference when they want to be judges. Maybe the people that should get the preference are the people that didn't make the money, gave up the money, did the harder work, and, incurred a cost for it. Those are the people I want to see on the bench because I already know where they're coming from. And, that's how you show it is by actually doing it, not talking about it, not philosophizing about it, not wishing about it, but actually doing it. So, writing is a great way to get noticed. Anyone can do it. It's not expensive. Plenty of outlets to be published now, more than ever before. Start, and it'll also make you a better writer because you start doing it earlier, doing it more. When someone wants to start paying you for it, you'll have already gotten good at it. That's wonderful. So nothing repulses me more than this idea of hiding principles that you believe because you think it might move you up in the chain, on the ladder, in the hierarchy. There were administrations in the past that took that approach and they got what they deserved. And there are administrations that have done it a little differently, and you see what you get when you act with principle. So at the end of the day, you're going to have a long life in the law. You're going to have a long life professionally. It's better to just do what you know to be right and let the chips fall where they may than to be pretending to be someone that you're not.
Excellent. We
David
have David
Rosenthal.
Rosenthal. Go ahead, David.
Hi there. You highlighted the judicial misconduct issue about judges
Yeah.
signing retirement letters based on political decision. What
Yep.
levers exist to take action against that sort of misconduct? Is there anything that a chief judge could do at the local level when there might not be the appetite in Washington to punish those judges?
Well, a misconduct complaint generates an inquiry, and an inquiry generates a response. And, every, judge is entitled to hire a lawyer or handle it themselves. And, but they need to respond and they need to take it seriously, as I'm sure they are taking it seriously. If they weren't taking it seriously, those cases would already have been decided and we'd all know about it. But it's been 6 months and there's no decision yet, which more than 6 months, which means someone is taking this very seriously. And I'm glad to see it. The judicial, from what I understand, the Second Circuit is adjudicating the Second Circuit Judicial Council is adjudicating those cases, and they will eventually issue an opinion after the judges have had an opportunity to respond, which is necessary and appropriate. Anyone accused of anything needs to have every opportunity to explain themselves. And, that process is unfolding and it's obviously taking a lot of time. What I hope to see is, an opinion from the Second Circuit Judicial Council publicly admonishing them for the behavior. Now, what the political actors choose to do in response to that is, outside of my realm. My view is simply that their decisions were blatantly partisan and require a response to uphold, the public's perception of a neutral judiciary, and so that future litigants in their courts, will know that other members of the court thought that that was inappropriate. I think, a public admonition would satisfy my concern personally, but as to the rest of the process, again, there are mechanisms in place to deal with it, and I'd be interested in seeing wherever it goes.
Thanks.
I mean, Rob, is this kind of the next the next expected ratcheting up of the tit for tat, that it's assumed that these district court judges, particularly the ones that are, causing the most sand to be thrown into the gears of be it, universal injunction, be it, now we're shifting into, class actions as remedies.
Look, I mean, it's certainly not my view that anytime a judge or a Democrat appointee rules against Trump, someone should file a judicial misconduct complaint. I'm not saying that. I'm not suggesting anything like that. What I am saying is that professionalism and ethical obligations matter. And if people are playing fast and loose with them, the judiciary doesn't get a pass because it's the judiciary.
Mm-hmm.
We all are lawyers. We all have professional responsibilities, and they don't disappear because you have life tenure. And I think that probably for far too long, the profession has just sort of taken the view that, oh, it's a judge, there's nothing I can do, and I don't want to do anything. Well, the internet allows word to travel far and wide now, and there's more accountability for people that otherwise probably got a pass. And so, just as all lawyers have to adhere to the rules of professional conduct for their states, judges have to adhere to a litany of rules, beginning with the codes of conduct. And, I think obviously a lot of lawyers who have to charge money by the hour for a living in front of these judges, don't want to file complaints against them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it's, even more important that people like the Attorney General, in this case, and this week, who filed one against a DC district judge, people who are in a position to be able to do this need to be able to do this when it's appropriate, because not everybody in the world is in a position to be able to absorb the political cost of speaking out.
What is on the menu between, these types of, complaints versus, taking a pure political, move such as impeachment? Like, what are the other possible moves here?
I mean, look, dozens of Democrat appointees have ruled against President Trump, and misconduct complaints have been filed against one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that, speaks for itself that, a lot of people are just disagreeing, but some people are behaving inappropriately,
Yeah, it does seem like the asymmetry is real. It's not imagined. Are you thinking that this is, as much as anything, the result of a small number but a very concerted group, as opposed to any broader sentiment among, be it Democratic appointments to the bench?
Well, look, I'm a seasoned veteran of judicial politics and confirmation wars, so I'm maybe a little bit more jaded than most people. At the same time, I'd like to think that when a litigant has a case in front of a judge, that regardless of what president appointed them, that they're trying to be as fair as possible. What I don't like is this sort of sense that I get from talking to judges, and I talk to a lot of judges, and just, hearing from people that there is a sense amongst some Democratic appointed judges that they need to do whatever they can to stop Trump. And, if you look at the data, a whole bunch of Democrat district court appointees are ruling against Trump, and a whole bunch of them are getting overruled when they go on appeal. So take what you may from that factual data set, but, I don't know that when, we recommended a nominee to the president, that we charge them with the responsibility of make sure you vote, if Biden's ever president, that you strike down anything he ever does because you're a Trump judge. Yet I'm not so confident that I feel that the other side has taken the same approach. How many Democrat appointees have ruled for Trump thus far this term? I think I have enough fingers on my one hand to count.
So last question is going to come from Hadley Arcus. Hadley.
Oh, Rob, I can't imagine anyone doing this better. You've covered the subject from every angle. You've covered it with wisdom, and it's been very moving. I've several things I want to ask you, but even do you expect an opening on the Republican side? I don't. But you mentioned this fact that the Republican nominees are open to attack at every level with a campaign of defamation that this just is unceasing. You've had a lot of experience. You have a very practical sense of how to go about things. Do you have any kind of sense of strategies for dealing with this or mechanisms for dealing with it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, New York Times versus Sullivan needs to be overruled. I've been thinking more about this, in light of Amell's situation, because he really has been subjected to literally defamation. Now, it's harder, of course, when you're nominated for a public position. The rules are different for nominees than private citizens. It's harder to win a defamation lawsuit against a nominee or a judge or a public official than someone who has none of those things. But, I suspect, look, Amell's going to be confirmed tonight and we'll move off of this. But the next time this happens to someone, I would expect to see some lawsuits filed. I just think that's where this is headed. If people want to impose taxes upon decent people seeking public office, then maybe they should incur some taxes themselves.
You're so right. Times versus Sullivan. Exactly right. Times versus Sullivan should be one of the first things to go. Right. But Rob, are you anticipating any of the Republican justices leaving soon?
Retirement, judge can retire whenever they want, and the White House is always ready.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Rob, for everything you've done. It's been terrific.
Sure.
All right. And now to close us, it's my pleasure to introduce to everyone Stephen Presley of the Center on Religion, Culture, and Democracy. Stephen.
Garrett, thank you so much for just partnering with us. Professor Luther, thank you so much. That was very insightful, very helpful, and as Hadley Arcus described, encouraging and makes us very optimistic about what lays ahead. So yeah, I just wanted to give greetings from the Center for Religion, Culture, Democracy, First Liberty Institute. Grateful for the work that we're doing together, excited for the days ahead, and grateful for these partnerships. So just want to say thank you very much. Garrett, if there's anything else we need to do to wrap up, just want to extend those greetings and thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And please stay tuned for emails with the next webinar, which we expect to be in August. So until then, thank you all.